Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for registering for this webinar. This is the 36th Palkhiwala Memorial Lecture, and the first which is virtual or which is on the internet. The Palkhiwala Foundation is a charitable trust started in memory of late Nani Palkhiwala, who was one of India's greatest constitutional scholars. And we have been conducting each year several lectures. Initially, we're conducting 4 lectures, and now we conduct 2 lectures a year. And we've had an impressive lineup of speakers, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi before he became Prime Minister, our Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. We've had Raghuram Rajan, we had Yashwant Sinha, Ram Jethmalani, Kiran Bedi, and a host of speakers whom I can't name here. The first lecture, of course, was by Mr. Soli Sorabji, who was Palkhiwala's junior. So it was in the fitness of things that we started with him. And we've been having excellent lectures. And I think that we could have not got a better speaker at this time than Dr. Ajit Ranade, who is the chief economist and the group executive president of the Aditya Birla Group. A brief biodata of Dr. Ranade. Dr. Ranade is an engineer from the IIT, Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, and then went on to do his management at the IIM Ahmedabad. After completing his studies in India, he went to the US and completed his doctorate at Brown University. He tells me that his interest was primarily in the interplay between mathematics and economics, and he did his doctoral thesis in a topic related to game theory. If this was not enough, he has won several awards, and I'll just mention 2 of them. He has received the Distinguished Alumnus Award from IIT Bombay in 2009, and he received the Scholar of the Year Award from Wadia Trust in 2010. In his professional capacity, Dr. Ranade is the chief economist for the Aditya Birla Group, and his role is basically to make an analysis of various factors that pertain to the group, what happens on policy issues, how it's going to impact the group. As you know, the Aditya Birla Group is one of the largest industrial houses in India. Apart from large number of Indian companies such as Hindalco and so on, they have companies in no less than 40 countries around the world. So it's truly a large Indian multinational. And I think Dr. Ranade plays a pivotal role in advising the board of directors and the chairman on the various issues. Apart from the business part and the economic part, as a lawyer, I have a special mention to make about Dr. Ranade. Not many of you know that the requirement, as you see, every election you get a list of assets of each candidate. What are his assets? 50 crores, 100 crores, whatever it is. Now, this requirement is not there in the Representation of People Act. How did it start? And the person who was responsible for doing it, one of the persons is none other than Dr. Ajit Ranade, who filed a PIL in the Delhi High Court saying that elections are part of the basic structure, free and fair elections, and the voters must know who their candidate is, what are his qualifications, what are his assets, and so on. This PIL was accepted by the Delhi High Court. Incidentally, they went to the Supreme Court, and in a rare move, you see, normally political parties never get united except when they have to increase their own salaries. But this time, all of them got together and decided to get rid of this thing by passing an ordinance. They went to the Supreme Court, they lost. Then they passed an ordinance to get over this judgment. Once again, Dr. Ranade challenged it, and he succeeded. So today, if all of us have the knowledge of who our candidates are, a lot of the credit must go to Dr. Ranade and his team. And he also told me that there is a website called myneta.in, which contains details of all the candidates, every election, MLA, member of parliament throughout the country. You have the biodata and the assets, the financial position of each and every candidate. So, ladies and gentlemen, you'll realize that we have a very, very interesting personality who's going to address us today. And he will speak on the economic prospects in the post-COVID world. As all of you know, we were marching towards the 5 trillion economy. The economy was in free fall. It was not doing very well. But the pandemic was a very, very serious blow to the economy. And we've just been told by the Prime Minister that we have got a 20 lakh crore package. But Dr. Ranade is going to speak on the medium outlook. What is the medium and the long-term outlook for the economy? post-COVID. COVID, of course, has had international ramifications, and I think we can look forward to a very, very interesting lecture by Dr. Ranade. Without much ado, I'll hand over the platform to him. But just to tell the audience, well, Dr. Ranade will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes. After that, my co-trustees Anand and Ranganathan will take questions. So I would request all of you to send your questions to Anand and Ranganathan. They will try to sort them out, and we'll have a question answer session. And we hope to wind up by 4:15 p.m. So I welcome all of you, and special welcome and special thanks to Dr. Ranade for accepting our request for our first virtual Palkhiwala Memorial Lecture. Thank you, sir, and over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Datar. Thank you for the very warm and kind introduction, very generous of you. In all fairness, sir, the work that we do at Association for Democratic Reforms is actually a joint work of many of us, including a vast network now for the last, now it's 20 years, a vast network, all India network of citizens organizations, as I call them. And it's been a long journey, and we've had some success. So thank you for mentioning that. I would like to thank the trustees of Palkhiwala Foundation for inviting me to for giving this lecture. I'm really deeply honored, and special thanks to the trustees, Mr. Anand, Mr. Arvind Datar, Mr. Ranganathan, Mr. Mahalingam, Mr. Balaji, Mr. Raja. So it's really, I would have loved it to be there in person. In fact, that was the original plan. But since we are in unprecedented and very unusual times, I have this now rather odd distinction of giving the first lecture in online. So as you said, I'm going to take just next 30 minutes to talk about a post-COVID prospects for post-COVID economic scenario. But perhaps we'll also talk a little bit about how we got here and what's the current context, and what are the implications going ahead. But I cannot resist, of course, saying a little bit about Mr. Palkhiwala himself, because it's in his memory that we're all assembled here, even if virtually. There's an interesting tidbit, while we are in the middle of a pandemic and a lockdown connected to the pandemic, sometimes a pandemic, or more specifically an epidemic, can have some surprisingly positive outcomes. So I'm told that actually it was an epidemic. Mr. Nani Palkhiwala was, as you know, was a BA and MA honors in English literature. He wanted to actually appear for the Indian Civil Services, the ICS. And for that, you had to go to Delhi. And as luck would have it, Delhi had an epidemic at that time. And of course, his near and dear ones were very much worried. So he decided not to fill the form for ICS. And his father, Ardeshir, persuaded him to actually that he was cut out for law. And that's how he follows his father's advice and pursued and got an LLB in 1944. And he came, of course, first class first, and then he got his advocate original side in 1946. So the loss of Delhi, the loss of the Indian Civil Services, was a gain to the world, I would say, to India and the world, of an outstanding jurist. But I'm sure if he had gone to Delhi as well, he would have shown as brightly. So this was the bright side, the positive outcome of an epidemic in Delhi. I also would like to mention, as you all know, and this is worth repeating, that Mr. Palkhiwala was singularly responsible for the Supreme Court of India laying down this unique principle, unique proposition that the right to amend the Constitution does not include the power to abridge or alter the basic doctrine or basic structure of the Constitution. It's a very famous judgment. But I'm told, and which is a very remarkable fact, that this is the only court in the entire world which has passed such an order. So, and I'm told that I just want to relate this because in response, whenever Mr. Palkhiwala was celebrated for this, in response, I think he used to say, and I'm paraphrasing, and that this shows the humility of the person, that he said that for 1300 years or maybe 2000 years, the Zoroastrians or the Parsis have got such excellent hospitality in this great country. And if I've done a little bit in in this contributed to this this landmark judgment. In a way, I'm just repaying a small debt. So it's really quite an amazing statement he made. I think that, the personality of his. Just one more thing about him, that, as you know, he was a tireless champion of constitutional liberties and human rights and individual freedom, and also a champion of, by the way, free enterprise, as you know, since we are talking about the economy. But I would like to maintain, and this is my impression, that at heart he was a man of great compassion. And I dare say, if not tendencies, he did have some sympathies towards to socialists. And I want to just read for the next 1 minute something that is one of his biographers has written, which I think captures the man and the man of principle. Nani was a man of principle and the epitome of humanness, embodying plain living and high thinking. He led a fruitful and yet frugal life. He strongly believed in the core values of Indian Dharma and practiced the virtues of self-discipline, self-restraint, and self-development. He was against the single-minded pursuit of material wealth. Life for him was a spiritual quest. More than his dazzling professional achievements, it is his exemplary qualities as a human being that stood out amid the vanity, the conceit, affectation, skullduggery, and chicanery all around him. In fact, later in life, Nani grew progressively distressed of the materialism and moral decline of institutions, and that had him worried about especially the decline in the values in our public life. Since Mr. Arvind Datar mentioned about the quality of public representatives in India. So this had him really worried, Nani, and he feared India was hurtling towards darkness and obscurantism. This is from a biography written by Mr. Bhandari, but I think this captures the personality, especially in his public life. And I believe we are in a time now where somebody like Nani would have played a rather stellar role in guiding a national life, especially as we are in a time which is not only of economic distress, but a grave developments with consequences for our institutions, I would say the society, or our legal frameworks and so on. But that's of course not the topic for today. But I thought I should again mention, and I'm really again deeply grateful for inviting me in a speech which honors an outstanding son of India. So today's topic is on post-COVID scenario. But to do that, I need to take stock of what an unusual time we live in. Such an unprecedented time. Who would have thought, the topic today is to look ahead and to sort of do a little bit of future gazing, if not for the long term, at least the medium term. And I'm reminded of an incident which happened in late 2008, perhaps it was October or November. This was a very big international seminar being conducted at the London School of Economics. And this was just in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, which had its origin on Wall Street. As you know, this was the famous Lehman crash, and which led to a huge financial and banking crisis, which expanded and engulfed the Western economies, and even this part of the world, and it became an economic crisis. So this was around that time, and London School of Economics had a seminar, and they had a VIP visitor. Her Majesty the Queen of England, and she came and she asked a very simple question, and this was amidst a galaxy of expert international economists. She asked, how come nobody saw it coming? It's a very simple question, and I would say it gets to the heart of the matter. And to this day, I don't think there's been a satisfactory answer to that question. How come nobody saw this great financial crisis coming? In that context, I just wanted to quote, when here I am trying to prognosticate about medium to longer term developments as the world is going through a huge churn caused by the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic is not the same as the financial crisis of 2008, but certainly the changes are coming and very abrupt, very discontinuous changes. So I just want to quote Sir Martin Rees, who used to be the master of Trinity College and who also was the president or the head of the Royal Society, a scientist and astrophysicist, I believe. And here is a quote by him about the human inability to predict the future or to predict the consequences. He says, in 1937, the US National Academy of Sciences organized a study aimed at predicting breakthroughs. This is the National Academy of Sciences, okay? And they had a rather detailed study involving lots of scientists, and they had to come out with a report. And this report, Sir Martin says, makes salutary reading for technology forecasters today. Sitting in 2020, if you look back at that report, which is trying to do technology forecasting, it came up with some wise assessments about agriculture, about synthetic gasoline, in fact, about synthetic rubber which is made not from trees but from petroleum. But what is more remarkable are the things that it missed. No nuclear energy, no antibiotics, although this was just 8 years after Alexander Fleming had discovered penicillin, no jet aircraft, no rocketry, no use of space, no computers, and certainly no transistors. The committee overlooked the technologies that actually dominated the second half of the 20th century. No internet was mentioned, mobile phones, the ubiquity of mobile phones, and still less they could predict the social and political transformation that occurred during that time. So I just want to bring that up because we are in the middle of really an unusual pandemic, which has thrown up some very, very what should I say, very contradictory developments. For example, who would have imagined that crude oil, which is one of the most heavily traded commodity in the world, would be selling at minus $37 per barrel. This is what happened a couple of weeks ago, where the West Texas Intermediate, WTI crude oil, the price plunged down, it went below zero, and the seller had to pay $37 per barrel to the buyer to take the stock. So who would have imagined this kind of a situation? Or who would have imagined that we are in the middle of a pandemic, we're trying to find a microorganism which has spread in the world, which knows no national boundaries, which doesn't knows no racial discrimination. But the country which is the most affected is the richest and the most powerful country in the world. Today, of the 500,000 affected patients or affected by the COVID virus, more than 1/3 are in America alone. And 1/4 of all the deaths reported, which are associated with COVID, are from the US. And even as we speak now, the growth rates are not really flattening. I mean, even today, if you ask people about the prognosis, nobody is able to give a definitive answer. And of course, as you know, until a vaccine is discovered, there's really no cure. So all we can hope for is flattening or herd immunity, or just live with it and live with it like we live with other diseases. So of course, this is not a lecture on the COVID virus per se, but I'm saying this is what has happened is that because of the pandemic, we had the lockdown, and the lockdown led to a demand shock, a supply shock, and a financial shock. The demand shock was caused by the fact that you had a sudden collapse in demand for things like airline travel, hospitality, tourism, even going to the malls, consumer shopping. You had a supply shock because of the lockdown. All the factories, 3/4 of the economy shut down. I'm talking about India, but it's true for many other countries. And we had a financial shock because the stock markets, in a matter of just 2-3 weeks, lost destruction of wealth to the tune of 50 lakh crores here in India itself. Of course, the strange thing is that, and these are the times of why I'm saying things are so unpredictable, that from the depths of the third week of March, The stock market actually has gone up by almost 30% in India itself. And who knows what tomorrow may bring, whether it's going to crash again or come back again. So as we try to understand the longer term impact of COVID and how we come out of this first progressive relaxation of lockdown and so on, I want to step back a little bit and remind you of the context of the Indian economy as we got into the COVID. Incidentally, while I mentioned the crude oil market globally, and some of that crash in oil prices has happened because because 30% of the demand has come down globally, since transportation is a major source and airlines airlines have been shut down. Cars are not on the road, trucks are not on the road. So a big part of the Western world demand is just not there, and therefore that is causing oil prices to uh, go down further. But even before that, even before this happened, there was actually an oil price war which was going on between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and this has something to do with the geopolitics of oil, the dynamics between OPEC members and non-OPEC members. Remember, Russia is not an OPEC member, and this also has got to do with the fact that the emergent rivalry, because the biggest oil producer in the world is neither Saudi Arabia nor Russia. It's actually United States. And the US oil comes from shale oil, which is different from the onshore or offshore oil that is drilled in either Russia or Saudi Arabia. But the shale oil requires that for its profitability, it requires that oil prices globally be at $40, $45. So this what began as perhaps a rivalry for the Russians to get back at the shale producers. And that's how they started cutting prices, extended to the Saudis who wanted to increase their market share vis-a-vis the competition from Russia primarily and not so much from the US. And that kind of spiraled into a price war, which was further aggravated by the pandemic and the lockdown. So as we step back, I just wanted to give you a context of where we were, say 5 years ago, starting 5 years ago. If you look at since 2000, say 15, 16, India's growth rate, GDP growth rate as measured by the government statistics. Now, I know there is a debate and controversy about the numbers, but since whatever the imperfections are in the measurement, they are there in the time trend, we can at least look at the trend. So the trend of the GDP growth has been that it has come down from, I think, 17, 18, 18, 19, 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19, and 19, 20. It has come down from 8% to 7% to 6% to 5%. So this is the declining trend, which is almost 4 to 5 years old. 8, 7, 6, 5. And if we are lucky this year, that is, we are in the middle of fiscal year 2021. If we are lucky, we will be at 0%. It may be marginally negative, and a negative number, which is the shrinkage of GDP, means that this would be this has never happened as far as I know. For India, we've never had GDP shrinkage, but we may actually be in a year when that might happen. So this is a 6-year. What I want to say is it's a 6-year trend, and it's not only GDP growth. If you look at India's export growth, so India's exports in fiscal year which ended in March 2014 was something like $300 billion or $305 billion. I'm talking about merchandise exports. 5 years later, in 2019 March, the number was still $300 billion. So end to end, if you look at the growth of exports, India's exports, it was 0%. There were some ups and downs, but of course, the fact is that exports are a major driver of our growth, and exports are highly correlated with industrial growth. Exports also are correlated with industrial employment, especially SME. But the export performance of India has been net over 5 years 0%. And of course, in the next year, of course, we had the US-China trade dispute, which started, I think, early 2018. This again precedes the pandemic, but the US-China TIF, I call it a trade dispute because trade war has different kind of connotation than imagery of tanks and aircrafts and guns, and so it is a trade dispute. But it has started with the US unilateral actions against imports of steel and metals from China, and then there was tit for tat, and it kept on escalating. So in these times, anyway, there seems to be protectionist tendencies in the world, which is not very beneficial or not conducive for world trade and export. So in a world where exports are going to be difficult because of protectionist sentiment, India's exports, which I just now said have grown at 0% over 5 years, continuing further may also be challenging. It'll be difficult to remember our exports in their heyday. Earlier years used to grow at 20% in dollar terms, and a very, as I said, very important driver of growth. So that is the story of exports. So GDP growth, exports. Then we look at capital investment. So if you look at GDP, what are the drivers of growth? Investments. So these are capital investments, which are largely made not just by the public sector, but private sector. So private sector capital investment is a major driver of growth. And that has to grow also at 15-20% per year. That has been actually stagnant for the last 4 years. The total investment to GDP ratio, which includes public sector as well as private sector investments, it is stuck at around 28%. It used to, the peak was around 36 or 38%. For the last 4 or 5 years, it's at 28%. Very, very simply, what you invest today, when you build new factories today, they become productive capacity tomorrow. So investment today leads to growth tomorrow. So you need, for high sustainable growth in the future, you need the investment to GDP ratio to be high. And for countries like China, which experienced 10% GDP growth over long periods, that investment to GDP ratio was as high as 50%. That is perhaps excessive, but certainly we need to be closer to 40% or 35%. We have been stuck at 28% for the last 4 years. We can go into the reasons. I don't know if we have time for that, but I can tell you. But that's a fact. I'm just reporting the fact. Then third thing. GDP, exports, investment, NPAs, the non-performing assets ratios. That these are the loans which have to be classified as non-performing, meaning the money is not going to be repaid. What happens is that the banks have to progressively become alert, vigilant. Suppose you give a 100 rupee loan and the chances of it coming back seem to decline or get more and more unlikely, then you have to make provisions. So initially you provide, say, 25 rupees against the 100 rupees just in case. But if the repayment is delayed by more than 6 months, 9 months, a year, then you have to provision 60% or 100% eventually, and then they are classified as NPAs. The non-performing asset ratio, that is non-performing loans to total loans, again for the last 5 years in a row has just gone up and up and up. It used to be some 6-7%, 8%, 9%, 10%. Now we are in the middle of a year which is actually like a recession, nearly like a recession. So obviously one of the consequences is going to be perhaps more bankruptcies. We have suspended bankruptcy law, I think, for some time. So perhaps these companies may not have to be subject to bankruptcy proceedings, but the banks have to recognize the non-performing loans. What happens is that when the bank recognizes NPAs, it is taken out of banking capital. And to that extent, it affects the bank's capacity to make new loans. Of course, some of the package that has been announced in the last week after the Prime Minister's announcement of a 20 lakh crore stimulus, the whole effort has been to increase the credit flow, to stimulate the credit flow from banks and other lending agencies towards corporates, towards small and medium enterprises, towards agriculture. But the fact is that the NPA ratio over 5 years has been increasing, and I don't think it was peaking. This year because of the pandemic, it's probably going to get worse. But even otherwise, it had not shown a reversal of tendency. This is not the time or the occasion to apportion blame. In the sense, we are not saying was much of this an inherited problem. It was lying hidden and it got exposed. We can debate and we can discuss that. But for this part of the lecture, I just want to state the facts. And the fourth thing I want to mention, apart from GDP, exports, capital, the investment ratio, and NPAs, and the fifth thing I want to mention is the fiscal bonanza. That is what happened in the middle of 2014. International oil prices were around $85-90. See, one of the big vulnerability or dependency of India, one of the big item or crucial resource that we don't have ourselves, we don't have in our national boundaries, is crude oil. So we have to import crude oil for our transportation needs and also various other sectors, including the production of fertilizer. So crude oil, fertilizer needs import of gas, but gas and oil are correlated markets, they're energy markets. We also actually import coal. So crude oil prices in the middle of 2014 were something like $85. But by September, October that year, the prices fell. They crashed to $35. And they remained so for the next 2.5 years. So the price of crude oil internationally crashed by almost 60%. However, the price of petrol and diesel in India did not crash, meaning it did not fall by 60%. If you were paying 80 rupees a liter for petrol at the petrol pump, that 80 rupees did not come down to 40 or 50 rupees. It stayed at 80, or perhaps it went down to 79, 78. So why was that? It was because the government of India decided that it would increase excise duties and keep the petrol prices for the consumers constant, in the sense that inflation would be like 0%, let's say. And in doing so, it reaped a fiscal bonanza. Why? Because excise duties on petrol and diesel go to the center, and also, of course, to the state governments. So the one estimate is that over the next about 3 or 3.5 years, the total fiscal bonanza to the central government was about 11.5 to 12 lakh crores. 12 lakh crores over 3 years, which is actually practically equal to 60% of the union budget, union tax revenues. And it's that big. It's the entire, perhaps it's equal to the entire annual GST collection today. That is the amount of fiscal windfall that the government of India got. And that was used, of course, as you know, it was used to fund social programs, it used various initiatives. Perhaps it was used to partially recapitalize banks. It was used for infrastructure spending. We can't. I mean, we can go into the specifics, and perhaps some of it was used to pass it on to the consumers. But what I'm saying is that fiscal bonanza, at least in my mind, does not seem to have translated into a growth impetus or a growth stimulus. Today also the same thing has happened. As I said, there's been a oil price crash internationally, and the government, again, in its wisdom, has decided to hike excise duties on petrol and diesel as a compensatory thing. So that leads to a fiscal windfall for the central government. They estimate this time is about, in 1 year, 1.3 lakh crores. And this is the money that's going to be used towards fiscal relief, fiscal stimulus, cash injection, or whatever. So that is the background where we come. So as we now look forward to the post-COVID economy, we have to, the point of giving this context was that we have to recognize that India's growth impulses, India's growth trajectory needs a radical, what should I say, redesign, or certainly needs to be, needs a, what should I say, a big kick or a fiscal stimulus. Clearly, we to get to, as the earlier, as Mr. Datar said, we had an ambition of reaching $5 trillion. Of course, we are going to reach $5 trillion. The question is when. If you want to reach $5 trillion in just, let's say, 5 years, then you have to double your GDP, because GDP today is $2.5, $2.6 trillion. And in order to double it in just 5 years, you need to grow at 12 to 13%. And that's in dollar terms. That's assuming that your currency does not depreciate. And to do that, your industrial sector perhaps has to grow at 14, 15%. Your services sector will have to grow larger, because agriculture never grows faster than 5 or 6% on a sustained basis. So leave aside the ambition to go to 5 trillion in 5 years, but we will eventually get there, because India traditionally has a positive GDP growth. And so long as it is positive at 6-7%, we will get there in about maybe 7, 8, 10 years. But the question is, we need to recognize that the GDP had been slowing down. So how do we reverse that? And I want to spend the next few minutes just talking about the prospects for the post-COVID recovery, as well as the economic scenario. The big challenge, I must say, is that we need a big boost to consumption spending on a sustained basis. And we need a big boost to investment spending, again, from the private sector, not just the public sector. And we need to ensure that we have a significant double-digit export growth. India's share of world export is about 1.7%. We can, even in a world which is struggling, which is showing tendencies, protectionist tendencies. Incidentally, I just want to a small tidbit. While the U.S. and China were having their trade dispute, which some people call trade war, and it was escalating, and even today there is talk of further action. At the height of this trade war between the U.S. and China, China delivered a fully constructed ocean liner, a cruise liner, to America, fully built in China, made in China. So much for the rhetoric. Even in the middle of 2019 or to the middle of late 2019, it was revealed that the US-China trade volume was $650 billion, $650 billion at the height of trade tensions. So let's not get misled by the rhetoric of trade saber rattling or trade war, because the fact is that the world is interconnected. The world will continue to have international trade, and even that's why in that context, I just want to say that it's true that we have certain protectionist sentiments in different parts of the world, including in India. But even in that world, if we manage to double our exports from 1.7% of global trade to 3.4 or 3% of global trade, that will be a huge, that's like our exports going from 300 billion to 600 billion. And that's eminently doable. And that will require a very focused strategy. But therefore, so as I said, looking ahead, the way this will, I think the post-COVID scenario has to acknowledge a few things. Number one, I'll just quickly go through the points. Number one is that agriculture, which contributes 14% to GDP, engages directly or indirectly something like 50 to 55% of the workforce. And this is simply not sustainable. So while we need reforms in agriculture, and some were announced only yesterday, and we need agriculture productivity to go up, and we need agricultural incomes to go up, to go up, but we need to recognize that the solution to agricultural problems and distress lies outside of agriculture. Basically, if you have very robust industrial growth and very robust growth in industrial jobs, we are not going to be able to cure agricultural problems. In fact, I remember there was a famous big survey done of rural agricultural households, and 40% of them responded by saying that they would gladly leave agriculture if only there was a secure and a job, well-paying job in the industrial sector or in the services sector. Services sector is even more challenging because typically service sector jobs require higher level of educational attainment, higher level of human capital. So we need to understand this basic principle that the solution to agriculture lies outside agriculture. Second, industry. While we try to increase industrial growth and manufacturing growth in particular, an interesting tidbit is that today the share of manufacturing to GDP in India, despite all our effort at Make in India and now this self-reliant, the focus on self-reliant, despite all this, today the reality is that the manufacturing to GDP ratio, manufacturing GDP to total GDP ratio is about 16%. And if you go back to 1991, when we began, the year of economic reforms, the landmark year, if you compare to 1991, because that's the biggest reform in 1991 was industrial delicensing. So it was a big shot in the arm for industrial growth or manufacturing. But the tidbit is that the ratio of manufacturing to GDP in 1991 was 16%. So over the last 30 years, from 1991 to 2020, the share of manufacturing to GDP is still stuck at 16 or 17%. The share of industrial workforce, the organized workforce, is only 12 million out of 480 million of India's workforce. Only roughly 12 million people have industrial jobs which are secure and what are called farmer sector jobs. So we have to recognize the challenges are there. And to add to it, there's a World Bank report which says that 69% of India's industrial jobs, mainly manufacturing jobs, are susceptible to automation and robotics. I've seen that even the conventionally labor-intensive sectors like textile, garment making, or leather industry, shoe making. I've seen Adidas factories where the complete shoe is made without any human hands touching it, or a garment. Modern techniques of garment making are such that even to make those buttonholes, or where even those things completely automated. So the trend in automation or robotics and 3D printing and what they call industrialization 4.0, 4.0, it may mean that as manufacturing jobs start moving out of China, or low labor cost, high productivity locations like China or East Asia, they will not move, perhaps not move only to Vietnam or Bangladesh as has happened in the garments and textiles in the last few years, but they may actually move back to America and Western Europe in developed countries, because it will be the automation will have reached economies, they'll have reached optimal level of economics where it makes sense to invest in automation. And so in that context, I would say a post-COVID scenario means that we have to face these challenges of focusing on industrialization with the challenges of automation and of course changing consumption demand. So I want to end by I don't want to sound I want to point out certain structural features which while I've kind of tried to describe the challenges, but I want to mention that there are some structural features in the Indian economy which we can use to play, we can play to our strengths. Number one is that it's a large continental economy with a large domestic content in GDP. That is to say, with China, for example, despite its 30 years of strong economic growth, today only 37 or 36% of Chinese GDP is domestic consumption. In India, this number is already at 65%. So like what Prime Minister talks about demand, what he means is domestic demand. So we have the potential market here, which we can piggyback on. Why not to ignore, not to neglect export markets, but the demography of India. Secondly, the combination of labor and capital. That is, India has typically a high savings rate, and the demography, the population which is of working age between 18 and 64, that portion is increasing, that subset is increasing. So both this demography advantage and high savings rate advantage is again beneficial, potentially can be harnessed for GDP growth. And that's a structural feature that doesn't depend on weather cycles, that doesn't depend on macroeconomic shocks, that doesn't depend on political cycles, it doesn't even depend on the pandemic. This is a structural, long-term feature of the Indian economy. And thirdly, of course, we have this infrastructure deficit. On many parameters, our infrastructure is far below world averages, and therefore that represents an opportunity for huge investments, whether from the public or private sector, which can sustain economic growth. And that's been the story in China as well. So it's domestically oriented, domestically focused. So that is something that we can, and that is not going to be vulnerable to risks like automation and so on. So between demography, domestic market, and the infrastructure deficit, and not to mention the human capital deficit. So we need to build our human capital, which again, in a flip way, is a growth opportunity, whether it is health and education sectors, with all the advanced features, not just conventional primary and health and primary education, but also a modern, extremely modern thing like telemedicine or distance learning or advanced skill formation, or India being a hub in this part of the world for skill training. So all these are opportunities which are there in the post-COVID world. So I think we should not lose sight of those opportunities, and of course innovation. So maybe I think I've overstayed my time. So I will stop here, and once again thank you for giving me the opportunity and the privilege of speaking at this forum. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajit Ranade, for presenting a very graphic account of the present situation arising out of the COVID, and also taking us through some of the challenges that are in front of us in the post-COVID world. The one comforting factor which came from your talk initially was that the last crisis was in 2008, that was the financial crisis. The present health come economic crisis is in 2020. So once the dust settles down in this crisis, maybe the next one will only be in 2032 if we are going to project the next crisis, which is going to be 12 years away. So to that time, possibly we can be a little relaxed, so to say, if arithmetic is going to be a part of history. But before I go to the Q&A, there's been a deluge of questions right from yesterday. And suffice it to say that it has covered a wide-ranging issues. We will try to cover as many of them, bunching them together. But I wanted to make one announcement, namely that we have 600 registered participants today. And it's really a tribute to the great Nani Palkhiwala that his first memorial lecture through a virtual medium has about 600 participants. So the first question, Ajit, actually is a question from me, and this was rotating in my mind from yesterday, ever since the finance minister made an announcement day before yesterday on the agricultural sector. There has been a path-breaking announcement suggesting an amendment to the Essential Commodities Act, which essentially frees up the pricing mechanism of agriculture, effectively stating that a farmer can probably produce in Kanyakumari and maybe distribute and sell in Kashmir itself without any intermediary layers coming into operation through technology. If this is going to be a game-changing change in the agricultural sector, is it going to redefine the whole economic paradigm in the agriculture area itself? Your thoughts?
So, Anand, thank you. Let me just remind that, as I said, the broad philosophy, the broad challenge for agriculture, the solution lies outside agriculture. If the rest of the economy can generate high quality, sustainable, well-paying jobs, then that will automatically be a solution to our agriculture problems. That's a broad principle. About unshackling agriculture and unshackling the pricing mechanism, of course, it's welcome. As you know, the electronic national agricultural market mechanism was started a few years ago by actually the NDA government. And they've been trying to push, but it's not really met with that much success. And to the extent that the mandis or the APMC framework is still a bit of a stranglehold, the middleman stranglehold. But please also remember that the problem of the farmer is that sometimes, and quite even now, the prices that the produce fetches is very low, are very low. So we still have that problem that we have 22 crops, and as of now, except for wheat and rice, and except for the states of Punjab, Haryana, and maybe a couple of other, everywhere the produce is selling well below MSP. At least that's the price that the farmer is realizing. So even if you manage to sell at free market prices, unfortunately they are not enough to sustain or provide a sustainable livelihood. So the problems are deeper. Of course it's good that the Essential Commodities Act is being modified or relaxed, and this to the extent that any unshackling is done, it's always welcome, definitely welcome. And unless we build things like the cold chain, if you're thinking that tomatoes produced in Chennai are going to be selling in Sikkim, that's not going to happen unless you have a very efficient supply chain. They have to be loaded onto trucks which have refrigeration facilities. They have to be traveling on roads which are such that you can travel in 20 hours, and so on and so forth. So it's connected with many other things. But of course, any unshackling of the farmer is welcome.
Yeah. Thanks, Ajit. And the next question, and a lot of people have asked this question, which has been agitating the mind of several economists as well. To propel the economy, there are different ways of doing it, particularly in a situation where we are in today. Is it not better to put money directly in the hands of the consumer and trigger demand for products and services, rather than making several announcements which will ultimately reach the consumer in a very indirect route? Which is the better option from an economic activity standpoint?
No, absolutely. So when we talk about a fiscal stimulus, we mean that it should provide a stimulus to consumption spending. Currently, we are in the middle of a lockdown, recession caused by the lockdown. So people have lost jobs, or people have lost incomes, or people have lost livelihoods. So it's important that there is some cash in their budget, household budgets, cash in the pocket, so they can start spending. Or the small and medium enterprises, and what to speak of even larger corporates, they have to continue to pay salaries, and they're running out of cash, so they need to get some cash injection. If not to the corporate or the SME, give it directly to the worker. I mean, since you have sometimes even in the so-called informal sector, contract workers still have a PF account, a provident fund account. So the company can produce an affidavit and proof that they have deducted PF. So give 80% or 90% reimbursement of the salaries directly to the workers. So what we now need, actually, you're right, we need cash injection. What has been announced is largely in the form of liquidity support, which is basically making it easier for banks and other lenders to give loans to SMEs. But SMEs currently who have no cash on their balance sheet, on their books of account, they need cash. So in that sense, we need a direct fiscal injection. Of course, the PM Kisan has done 500 rupee per family, I think per person. But we need much more. I think I would say something like 8 to 10,000 rupees per household, at least for the next 3 to 6 months per month. That's the kind of payment you need into large number of households.
Yeah. Thanks, Ajit. And most senior citizens are quite anxious today. Interest rates are coming down, the capital market being extremely volatile, mutual funds, you know what's happening in that area as well. So the question some senior citizens are raising is, what is going to be the future outlook on interest rates? It's a very difficult question to answer precisely. But where do you think they should be parking their funds? They don't want an investment advice, but generally the interest rate versus saving, what is your take on that?
No, I'm a very poor investment advisor, so it's completely a wrong idea to ask me about investment advice. But we are in the middle of a recession-like situation in India, and globally also there's a recession. Globally, by the way, most economies are going to shrink. That means growth rates are going to be negative for US, for UK, Germany, Japan, and therefore interest rates there are actually zero, close to zero. So in India also interest rates have come down. If you go to a bank and try to put your money in a fixed deposit, I think you'll be lucky if you get a 4% or 4.5% for 1 year deposit. And I believe they're going to remain low in the foreseeable future. So interest rates will remain low. And therefore, what do pensioners do? It's a very difficult situation. I mean, I know, I wish this is not easy. I know there are still some instruments where there are administered rates, Government of India, and there are many schemes, and we have made representations that especially for pensioners, that is retired people, you have products which have higher interest rates, but only focused on that segment of depositors. So perhaps there are opportunities like that, and that's probably necessary. But otherwise, the overall interest rate scenario in the country is going to, I mean, is a low interest rate scenario for the next foreseeable future.
Yeah. The next set of questions is around China, and you did refer to China in your talk. And a lot of webinars have now focused about the entire supply chain shift from China, shifting manufacturing outside China. How is India going to gain out of it, and so on? Do you think we should be doing something proactive to attract more investments, considering the China factor now, or are we doing enough in that area?
No, we definitely need to do a lot more, much more, to make sure that if companies, I told you the US the US-China trade dispute started early in 2018. So we are almost in its third year now. So it predates the pandemic, and the pandemic has only made it more fractious, more contentious, the relationship. And I think it also plays into the US domestic politics. So both the Democrats and the Republicans find it advantageous to be basically do China bashing. And this is on this issue, there is a bipartisan support. So even the Democrats will not disagree with President Trump on this. And this will go on till the elections in November. So as a result of that, many companies are looking at that they are handicapped if they export goods from China to America, and a lot of exports are happening. I told you bilateral trade is still $600 billion. So, but if they export merchandise from China directly to the US, they face a import tariff duty of 20%. So instead, if they export it from other countries, like third countries like Vietnam or Thailand, Malaysia, then they face zero duty or very low duties. That is their incentive to move out of China. The supply chain is not going to move out whole and soul. I mean wholesale. It will be an alternate sourcing. So to that extent, India certainly must proactively and very aggressively conduct economic diplomacy to ensure and attract whichever firm wants to locate and do the supply chain sourcing from India. There is an opportunity, but I think this window of opportunity is not more than, say, about 18 months. So we need to pursue this quite aggressively.
Yeah. The next one is, aside China, I think India has relied on FDI in a very focused manner from 1991 when we opened up our economy. And today, of course, the situation has demanded that we become self-reliant for various reasons. But I don't think it's a either or situation. We need to move in both directions in a very calibrated fashion. The question is, what do we need to do to make the appropriate balance between self-reliance and also attracting foreign direct investment in a very proper manner?
Yeah, Anand, this word self-reliance has not been well defined. Even the Prime Minister's speech, he said quite a bit, but he also qualified by saying self-reliance doesn't mean becoming isolated, doesn't mean being purely protectionist. So there were a lot of qualifications. So he says self-reliant doesn't mean that we don't engage with the world. Because, the self-reliance word comes from our early industrialization strategy of 1950s and 60s, which was a completely import substitution-led strategy of industrialization. Domestic industrialization was going to be focused mainly on substituting for imports. So imports were a bad idea, bad word, and whatever it takes, whatever technology we could source or whatever the cost of production, we would produce it in India. And that didn't work because the most famous case or sort of a iconic case is that the company called Morris gave automobile technology to two firms in the 1950s. I think one was the Ambassador and the other one was a little known company called Toyota. So this import substitution based strategy, I think perhaps had a context and had a relevance, but we pursued it. It outlasted way beyond its relevance. And I don't think the self-reliance that is being emphasized today is in that same sense. So what does it really mean, self-reliance? I'm not able to define it sharply. I think I would think it is similar to the Make in India concept, which was articulated by the Prime Minister back in 2014 and 15 and so on, which is that make India the hub of global manufacturing. So upscale the quality of manufacturing and products and services in India so that global companies will want to make this, if not a global hub, at least a regional hub for the small car, for let's say diesel engines, for tractors, or for mobile phone assembly or electronics, or so that makes sense. And so make in India, not just for India, but for the world, but at globally competitive price and cost and globally competitive quality. And for that, what do we need to do? We need to do whatever we need to do. We need to make sure the infrastructure is appropriate. We need to make sure that the ease of doing business, parameters are top notch. We need to make sure, most importantly, that these investors who will come and set up manufacturing facilities here, they face policies which are stable, which have continuity, stability, and predictability. I don't have to remind you that at least in 3 high-profile cases, we've done, unfortunately, flip-flops. Companies have come and set up investments here, and then the laws turned around. They went against them. So that is the opposite of what investors want. Investors want stability, continuity, and predictability. All other parameters, we are getting there. Our taxation is now on par with East Asian neighbors. Our electricity access is good. Our access to credit capital is good. Maybe our dispute resolution and contract enforcement needs to improve, and that's for the lawyers and the judiciary and the judicial mechanism to take care. But most importantly, we need to give the investors not just a red carpet welcome, but predictability, continuity, stability of policies.
Yeah. Thanks, Ajit. Last question from my side, and then I will hand the mic over to V. Ranganathan. The question is very pointed, and it requires a direct answer from you. It is emanated from your own state. How will you rate the government's handling of the economic crisis triggered by the present pandemic on a scale of 1 to 10? You have to give a pointed answer because it is from your state.
No, I'm not in the rating business, so I'm not qualified to give a rating. I think this is a very challenging time. If you look at the India's ratio of deaths, if you're talking about the pandemic, the deaths caused by the COVID virus as a percentage of the population, we are probably the lowest in the world. And in that, at least on that metric, when you rate something, you have to define the metric. It's not a very subjective gestalt, impression. On the metric of deaths per population, we are low. But in terms of, let's say, handling the relaxation of lockdowns, we could have done much better. I mean, the whole migrant situation where we see these painful images, rather tragic images of people walking for hundreds of kilometers, trying desperately to go to the villages. Some people are getting killed on the roads or on the railway tracks. That's definitely extremely tragic, shameful, embarrassing. That's nothing to be proud of. But many things that we could do right. So I don't want to do a rating. I just want to add one point here. The Western press gives a lot of kudos to countries like Germany. They say that Germany has done so well. It's a decentralized public health system, and they have extensive testing and tracing. But did you know that Germany has 5,500 deaths so far, and it's increasing? The slope is still upward. And while Iran has much lower deaths than Germany, did you know that Vietnam has 0 deaths? Believe it or not, 0 official COVID deaths. Did you know that Kerala has only 2 deaths in the last 3? Only 2 deaths. Did you know that Taiwan and South Korea have very, very low fatality rates? So I think the Western media finds it like an idol. I'm not here to accuse anybody, but I'm just using the word Western media in a somewhat loose sense. But these examples are seen as very interesting curiosities or exceptions, and something interesting is going on in Vietnam or Kerala, but hey, maybe we are doing something right in those situations. Maybe Vietnam's health system is reacting the right way. We need to learn from that. So the similar in our own country, we need to learn from what is the strategy that Kerala is adopting, or some other states who have managed to keep it low. So let's not only I think there are lessons to be learned, and of course, it's one thing to manage the spread of infection, but quite another to manage the economy and restarting the economy.
Over to V. Ranganathan for the balanced questions and concluding remarks.
I think the question coming to you is a bit telescope kind of question, because there are about 5 or 6 connected.
Not able to. Can you just come closer to the microphone?
The microphone is just hanging by my throat. So I think, are you able to hear me now?
Can you come closer to the microphone?
The microphone is actually in my hand.
Okay.
It's unmuted. It's not working. Is it better now?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a kind of a telescope question. There are about 4 or 5 themes which are woven into a single question, because these are many points which have come from the participants. What is the scope of the fiscal stimulus which the government has given so far? Is it adequate? And where is the government going to find the resources to manage the existing fiscal stimulus, and what is additionally required? And is there a need for a new budget or a white paper on the economy that the government should come out with to clearly make people understand how much the revenue the government will raise in the coming days? What is the total additional expenditure caused by this COVID, and how are they going to fund and finance it? So if you can answer this as one opposite question, then I think it's very well.
Yeah. So the first question was: is the fiscal stimulus announced so far adequate? So if by that question you mean the 20 lakh crores which was announced by the Prime Minister in his speech, I think on Tuesday, and then subsequent clarifications or details given by a series of press conferences by the finance minister, and one of them will be today and one another tomorrow, then I would like to remind that not all of it is fiscal stimulus. I like to distinguish between liquidity and actual fiscal spending, or rather trying to address the problems of illiquidity versus insolvency. So what we have in India right now, because of the lockdown, is a collapse in aggregate demand. I told you, we have a very unusual situation where there's a demand shock, which means a great collapse of aggregate demand. We have a supply shock, and we had a financial shock. So supply shock, of course, means that factories that need to be reopened. So we need to have a reopening timetable and movement of cargo, logistics, trucks, and get the workers back to the factory. So that is where the way that supply shock is going to be addressed. But a demand shock requires a demand to be that we make up for the shortfall in demand. And the only way that can happen is by putting some money into the consumer's pocket so that the consumer can spend. By providing liquidity and loans, that is not a substitute for actual fiscal stimulus or fiscal injection of cash. So when I say fiscal stimulus, I mean money coming out of the government's own treasury. And liquidity support is what comes out of banks or RBI or funding agencies, lending agencies, NBFCs. So I think much of the support that we have seen nearly 6 lakh crores of liquidity being pumped by the RBI, even before the Prime Minister's speech. They had given huge amount of very low cost funding to banks, commercial banks. They had given huge amount of targeted funds for banks to give it to NBFCs. And they had created a large fund to help mutual funds in case of panic redemptions by investors. That is all called liquidity support. Liquidity support means if you are running out of cash, if there's a mismatch between your revenues and your outgo, we will be here to give you. It's like bridge financing. Similarly, what the finance minister announced, she said MSMEs will be given additional 3 lakh crores of loans. These loans, of course, will have the nice property that they won't be any collateral, and you won't have to pay any. It's a moratorium for 1 year. But here it is: take some loans. But fiscal stimulus requires that people get money to buy food. Fiscal stimulus requires that you actually universalize the distribution of wheat and rice and other things through the PDS system. Universalize it. Give it to ration card holders as well as non-ration card holders, and give it at 3 rupees, 2 rupees. In fact, it requires, in many cases, especially for the urban poor, it requires the distribution of cooked food, ready-made food. The NGOs are willing to partner with the government. The Niti Aayog has a portal where they have officially recognized and registered some 57,000 NGOs, and they're willing to partner with the government. But you can't ask the NGOs to purchase wheat and rice at exorbitant prices of 25, 30 rupees a kilo. They should also be given rice and wheat at 3 rupees, 2 rupees kilo, which is the PDS price, the ration shop price, so that they can help make the cooked food and distribute it to the bottom poor. That is the fiscal injection, giving fiscal support for food distribution, transfer of food grain from the FCI godowns to the PDS machinery, increase in spending on MNREGA, giving support to the consumer spending, giving support to SMEs and corporates to pay for the salaries of workers, or even paying, clearing all the pending dues. Incidentally, we have been saying for long to the government that please clear all the pending dues, the payments which are due from either the government itself or government departments and PSUs to their vendors. This itself is about 5 lakh crores. Well, now that's not really a stimulus because it's already due. This is the invoice. These are invoice payments which are not in dispute. We have also the government says we are giving you income tax refund, but that is money that is already owned by the it belongs to the taxpayer. But even that that goes some way. So I think we need to increase the component of the fiscal injection. Now the question is, how is the government going to finance it? Personally, I think there should be a private arrangement between the Reserve Bank of India and the Government of India, where they do a private placement of bond, maybe a special category bond. The government can also float a special category COVID bond to the retail investors, where it has say 5 or 6% interest and tax free for 20 years. The government could also, we have suggested that loan against shares. See, the government owns public sector enterprises, and the combined value of these public sector enterprises today is about 11 or 12 lakh crores, not including Life Insurance Corporation, LIC. So the government can pledge its shares with the with the RBI and get funding for that and then spend that. So there are various creative ways of doing this funding. I am not personally advocating going abroad. We should not go outside India and borrow money in dollars, because that's a very dangerous thing. Because then we get exposed to currency risk, and the currency can go against us abruptly. We borrow $100, but we end up paying through our nose, because the dollars the exchange rate can go against us. So I would not advocate. In fact, that's a great strength of India, that you can actually borrow most of the money domestically. So in a way, it is like either left pocket owing the right pocket, or that the present generation owing money to the future generation. So we are borrowing from future unborn generation. When you increase the fiscal deficit, essentially you are borrowing money from future citizens of India who are not even born yet. But that's okay. It's all within the country's borders.
We are just left with 5 minutes, Ajit, to finish. So there are two questions, and you can perhaps give a very quick and crisp answer to both. I thought both of them are very important, so I don't want to skip any of them. The first question is, when do you see the economy rebounding? Which sectors will rebound first, and which sectors are likely to be under strain for a long time?
Well, sectors like consumer goods, essential goods and services, pharmaceuticals, medicines, they never stop. So those are the production is continuing, and they will continue. And in fact, I think they will do well, including healthcare related industries. Agriculture is doing well. We had a good Rabi harvest, even though the prices are a little low. But the crop is a bumper crop, and I think with a normal monsoon, hopefully the Kharif crop also next year will be good. So agriculture, and if we can have some way of a mechanism of ensuring good incomes for the farmers. So agriculture, which is 14% of GDP, will be reasonably good. Healthcare, pharma, even I would say anything to do with digital. One of the impact of the lockdown is that suddenly there's a spurt in digital related activities. And I think eventually, if the government really embarks on a very strong infrastructure spending program, the finance minister announced a NIP, National Infrastructure Pipeline. If we accelerate the building of highways, roadways, ports, and so on, that in turn create demand for construction materials like steel, cement, and even construction labor. So that also should give a good shot in the arm to the economy. I think manufacturing also will come back to some extent, but the sectors which will not come back so quickly are anything related to hospitality, airlines, hotels, restaurants, tourism. That will take some time. So my guess is that this year, fiscal year 21, as I said, we may just grow at 0%. When I say 0%, by the way, it means that we will produce national income worth 200 lakh crores. 0% growth for India means 200 lakh crores of income for Indians. I mean, that's, while zero sounds scary, but and zero is not enough for sustaining our poverty reduction pace, but it still is something. And next year, I think if we are lucky, then we may go back to 5-6%, depending on the V-shaped recovery.
I'll wind up with the last question, which I thought was quite interesting and a little different from the earlier questions. See, the COVID has pushed a lot of this expenditure to the state level. A lot of the responsibilities have moved to the states. But the entire resource raising capacity now rests only with the center, with the GST being a common national tax. So how do you see the political implication of this?
Yeah, this is a very important question. You see, the frontline fight against the pandemic and coming out of it, the lockdown, is the responsibility of the lower tiers of government, that is state governments, and even lower tier, which is municipalities and district administrations. Unfortunately, the money is with the center. So our entire federal system today is such that 2/3 of the spending obligations are at the state level or at the lower levels, but only 1/3 of the revenue raising capacity is at the state level. So this is an inbuilt mismatch in our federal structure, and it has gotten a little more inflexible because the states surrendered their right to raise taxes, sales tax, as a part of the grand bargain, which is called GST. So the central government surrendered its right to impose excise duties and service tax. The state government surrendered its right to impose sales tax, and we have the GST. But in doing so, and then of course we have the Finance Commission machinery to allocate money back to the states. But the states are definitely struggling. And to compound matters, what has happened is that the GST compensation, which was promised to the states, you see, as part of the grand bargain for the first 5 years, the states were promised income revenue growth of 14%. That has not been forthcoming. There is money which is pending with the center. So that is an urgent requirement. So referring back to an earlier question, what fiscal stimulus do you need? I forgot to mention that a major part of the stimulus also should be a transfer of these resources from the central government to state governments, which is rightfully theirs. But this is going to be a challenge. I think we need to find ways to perhaps broaden the GST tax base and find ways to have natural buoyancy to the state revenues. Otherwise, this tug of war will continue.
I wish we had half an hour more because we had 145 questions. I think we covered only about 45 or so in a comprehensive way. See, when we wanted to do this meeting over video conferencing, I think there was a lot of hesitancy among the trustees. How a memorial lecture and being delivered by a very eminent person like Ajit Ranade be done on the video conferencing. But I think this has been extremely fruitful. We have had about 650 participants from all across the country, which we could have never accessed. The meeting was a physical one held in Chennai. And doing a meeting at 3 o'clock in Chennai during summer months, you know what it is like to get people across to a particular place. So I think it has been, on the whole, an extremely rewarding experience for all of us listening to you and getting your clarifications. And to the participants, I would like to offer our thanks for registering in large numbers, and do await the further announcements from us, because this has been a grand success in terms of doing a video conference meeting. We hope to do one subsequently in the month of August or so. So thanks everyone, and thanks Ajit. It has been extremely nice interacting with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.